In a town forgotten by the rain, where dust was more plentiful than compassion, an unimaginable scene was unfolding. On a rickety wooden platform, it wasn't livestock or land being sold, but three sisters, put up as merchandise by their own father. Before the curious eyes of the crowd, each with her own form of resignation, they stood like three statues of sorrow. Amidst that cruel silence, a man watched quietly from a distance. He had only come for salt and coffee, but fate had just placed him before a choice that could change everything. The town of Hope's End had forgotten the scent of rain. For a month, the sky was just a pale, motionless streak, as if holding its breath to witness the disgrace unfolding below. The wind only lazily curled the dry dust at the feet of passers-by, a dust that seemed to want to cover the scene in front of the Last Chance Saloon, right there. A makeshift platform had been erected from old crates and a few rotten planks, looking as rickety as the dignity of the man standing upon it. The crowd had gathered before noon, some to kill time, others out of a vicious curiosity, and a few with heavy coin purses and empty eyes. They watched Elias Vance, a man whose life was a series of losing gambles, shuffle a deck of worn-out cards as if playing his final hand against fate. He never waited for misfortune to find him. He dragged it behind him like a loyal pet. With a sneer and a twitching mustache, he called out a price for goods no one had yet bid on: 3 healthy girls. He shouted, his voice hoarse with the smell of cheap liquor. 1 for the kitchen, 1 for the bed, and 1 will sing your sorrows away if your souls are weary enough. To his right, his 3 daughters stood, 3 statues carved from 3 distinct sorrows. The eldest, Molly, stood with a spine as straight as a silent challenge, her arms crossed over her chest, her gaze sharp as a dagger. She wore her pain like armor. Next to her, June looked like a wild animal cornered, her teeth clenched, her eyes burning with the smoldering fire of unspent rage. And then there was Mabel, the youngest, standing a step behind, her eyes gazing into the void, lost in a melody only she could hear, her small body swaying gently from the shade of a wagon across the way. A man watched in silence. His frame was sturdy, his shoulders broad but heavy with the weariness of years. It was Thomas Granger, owner of the Pinewood Valley Ranch, a man the town knew only as a familiar but distant figure. He rarely came to town, unless the well ran dry or a storm broke the fence. Behind him, his 3 grown sons sat on the wagon, shifting restlessly, glancing from their father to the crowd. Thomas had only come for salt, some nails, and a little coffee, but fate never knocks politely. It strikes like a blade, and by the time you realize it, your hands are covered in blood. He watched Molly, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, fearless, as if searching for and challenging anyone who dared to meet her eyes. She had no ring on her hand, no child at her hip, no protector, only a spine and a grief worn like a second skin. Thomas saw June's lip curl in contempt as a man in the crowd laughed too loudly. And little Mabel, still blinking in the sun, her lips moving to her own invisible song. Thomas shifted his weight. The youngest girl looked like his late wife's sister at 13, slender but not fragile, just so tired, worn down by things a child should never have to face. Elias's voice rang out again, tearing through the air. Let's not pretend. They won't stay virgins for long. Better you have them before the saloon keepers do. He paused, then shouted the price. I'll start at $15 each, or $40 for the lot. A silence fell, not a natural silence, but one that was forced, as if the air had been sucked from every lung. No one spoke. It was then that Thomas stepped down from his wagon. The heels of his boots crushed the silence as he walked forward slowly. The crowd parted, suddenly finding their own shoes or the sky above intensely interesting. He said nothing until he stood directly below the wooden platform. Let them down, he said, his voice low and needing no force. Elias blinked. What? Thomas's voice remained at the same volume. "Let your daughters down. And get off that platform. Before I throw you across the street," Elias scoffed. "Who the hell do you think you are? A man who's tired of cowards selling what they've broken and still calling it their own." He turned to the crowd. "All of you came here to watch. I hope you choke on what you saw. This is not a stage, and they are not cattle." Elias's hand twitched, moving toward his coat, but Thomas's gaze pinned him, heavy as a rifle barrel. The gambler faltered, then spat on the planks and stepped back, muttering curses. The three girls remained motionless. Thomas looked at Molly. "You are free to go. But if you have nowhere to be, I have a house with rooms that don't leak. I have sons who know how to keep to themselves, and soup that is never thin. You will owe no debt." Molly's eyes narrowed. "Why? Because someone should have stopped him a long time ago. And because I gain nothing by standing here." With that, he turned and walked back toward his wagon. The crowd parted around him like a flock of sheep suddenly remembering the presence of a wolf. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, Molly stepped down. Her two sisters followed, Mabel still humming her tune. They climbed onto the back of the wagon, settling themselves between sacks of feed and coils of rope. Thomas never looked back. The road out of town was narrow and dusty, but it seemed to be leading to a place with more air to breathe. The next morning, the Granger house seemed to be holding its breath. It wasn't louder, nor was it more crowded. Just a different kind of silence had fallen, as if the wind had shifted direction and no one knew if it would bring a storm or the spring. Thomas rose before dawn, as he always did. He moved through the kitchen in silence, setting a kettle on the stove and grinding coffee beans slowly, as if the slightest noise might shatter something still too fragile. He didn't notice Molly was already at the table until he turned around. She said nothing, only nodded once. Her eyes were still sharp, but held a deep weariness. Her hands were wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, as if clinging to an invisible anchor. She hadn't poured any coffee yet. Perhaps she was waiting for a bit of warmth, or a welcome. He nodded back and filled 2 mugs. They drank in silence, a kind of treaty without a treaty. Outside, frost still clung to the fence posts, and the barn roof gleamed under the weak morning light. Thomas's sons were already up. Levi was splitting wood near the shed. Caleb was brushing down the mare, and Mark was once again trying to fix the crook door of the chicken coop. Inside, the other girls began to stir. June walked barefoot across the wooden floor, her shoulders wrapped tightly in a thin blanket, her gaze as sharp as a shard of glass. She glanced at Thomas, then walked past him to sit beside Molly. Mabel was the last to emerge, still in yesterday's clothes, her hair a tangle from sleep. She didn't speak, just leaned her head against June's shoulder. June blinked softly but didn't pull away. Thomas cleared his throat gently. "You'll have your own rooms," he said, his voice low and warm. "There will be no latches and no one. We'll enter without knocking. If you need anything, just ask." Molly looked straight at him. "And what do you expect from us?" He shook his head. "Nothing you don't want to give. Then why?" "I already told you. This house was empty, and you needed a roof." The silence that followed was not hostile. It was just long, the kind of silence that needs space to be understood. Later that day, the 3 sisters explored the house. Molly chose the room with the east-facing window. June, perhaps out of stubbornness, took the smallest room. Mabel chose the one with a faded child's charcoal drawing pinned to the wall, a tree with stars nestled in its branches. The house had only 1 bathroom, and the plumbing worked when it felt like it, but it was warm, clean, and quiet. The girls didn't seem to know what to do with all that quiet. The Granger boys kept their distance. Levi always watched from afar, always working, rarely speaking. Mark tried to be friendly, but his nervousness made him awkward. Caleb, the youngest, hardly dared to look up when spoken to. He would steal glances at Molly, then quickly look away as if the sight burned him. Molly watched all of them. She didn't trust easy things. She moved through the house like someone who always expected a door to lock behind her. On the second night, as she sat by the fireplace, she suddenly asked Thomas, "Have you ever been a cruel man?" He didn't flinch. "No." "What about a weak one?" His eyes stayed on the flames. "Yes." Molly nodded, as if that answer had made him real. Meals were quiet affairs. The girls cooked when they felt like it. The boys washed dishes without being asked. The balance was precarious, a dance to which no one knew the steps. But no one raised their voice. No one raised their hand. The first time June and Levi clashed was when she left her muddy boots in the hallway. He simply asked her to move them. "You run this place like a church," she snapped. "No," he replied, "but I built this floor with my own hands, and I'd like it to last." Her jaw tensed, but she moved the boots. Later, she brought in an armful of dry kindling without a word. One afternoon, Mark again found Mabel humming as she walked the fence line. He didn't interrupt, just quietly followed behind her, fixing a broken gate latch. She glanced at him once, blinked, then continued to hum. The house began to breathe again. Thomas spent most of his evenings on the porch, not far, just sitting and carving little birds from cedar wood. He used to make them for his wife. He didn't tell the girls that. He didn't need to. On the fourth day, Molly stepped into the barn. She saw Caleb moving hay bales, his arms tense, his movements sharp. He saw her and dropped the pitchfork. "Sorry," he stammered, backing away. "I'm not a rattlesnake," she said. "I know," he replied quickly, then added, "It's just that you move." So quietly, she looked at him for a long moment. "You're afraid of me?" "No," he said, honest and unflinching. "I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing." She tilted her head. "Then don't say anything." He nodded, and they stood there in silence. She didn't mind it. That evening, at dinner, Mark tried to make a joke. June almost smiled. And Mabel, for the first time, laughed out loud. The sound was clear, unexpected, echoing across the table like a lost note. Even Thomas chuckled softly. Later that night, Molly passed Thomas on the porch. "You didn't ask what happened to our mother," she said. "I figured if you wanted me to know, you would say." She nodded. "He sold her first, to a man in Kansas. We never saw her again. I'm sorry. We stopped being sorry a long time ago." He offered her the bird he had just finished carving that night, a simple, unfinished dove. She took it without a word. Mabel found an old sewing kit and started stitching scraps of cloth together. June began to wear her hair in braids again. Molly started waking up earlier, not because she had to, but because the quiet before dawn felt like it belonged to her. The house was no longer holding its breath. It began to breathe, deep and steady breaths. And in that quiet, something had begun to take root. Something patient. Something real. Spring did not arrive with a trumpet's call, but crept in like a whisper. The snow on the hills began its lazy melt, and the small creek behind the house started to sing again. This year the fences held steady, and the wind that blew through the bare cottonwood branches carried a whisper that awoke the still shy buds. Inside the Granger house, change came just as slowly. Nothing grand, nothing spoken, just the quiet rearrangement of lives placed side by side. Molly began her mornings with a broom, sweeping the hallway from back to front without being asked. It wasn't obedience. It was control over something. Anything. June took to the porch steps at twilight to sharpen her knives, the strokes slow and deliberate, more out of ritual than fear. And Mabel had turned the old storage closet into a world of her own, stringing threads across the wall, weaving scraps of fabric into something nameless. Thomas watched it all without comment. He understood the power of stillness. He knew that healing doesn't gallop. It walks barefoot, careful not to startle the pain that lies beneath. The boys had settled too. Levi repaired the barn roof with Molly nearby, neither speaking, both just working. Mark managed to coax a laugh from June every few attempts. Caleb would sometimes linger by Mabel's doorway, not speaking, just listening to her hum. It was in the middle of April that the well ran dry. One morning, Thomas stood beside it, the bucket drawn up with nothing but gravel and silence. He scratched his beard, sighed, and looked toward the river half a mile away. By midday, a human chain had formed, sons and daughters alike, walking the path to and from the river with the rhythm of necessity. No one complained, no one paused. Even Mabel joined in, carrying a tin pail nearly half her size, full of determination. That evening, as they sat on the porch, Molly looked at Thomas and said, "We should dig another well." He raised an eyebrow. "That's hard work," she nodded. "I'll help." "So will I," Levi added. The next morning, the digging began. A slow, sweaty, and stubborn task, the kind that grinds all conversation into silence, where the only sound is the bite of shovels into the earth and the pull of breath from lungs. Molly didn't hesitate. She worked beside Levi, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back, her hands blistering without a single grimace. At noon, Thomas brought out bread and apples. They sat on the dirt, the sun baking their backs. "Have you ever built anything?" Levi asked her. Molly looked at him. "A shed." "It collapsed." He grinned. "Then you've got a good start." That night, she soaked her hands in salt water, wincing only once. Caleb left a jar of ointment outside her door. No note. She used it. The next day, June asked Mark to teach her how to properly saddle a horse. He blinked at her as if he hadn't heard right. "Well," she said, hand on her hip. He scrambled to agree. They spent the afternoon in the corral. June cursed the cinch strap, cursed the heat, cursed the dust. And then, finally, she laughed. Not loud, not careless, but a real, unguarded sound that startled even the mare. Mark didn't say much, he just smiled. She saw it, and her laughter stopped, softening into something unreadable. "Don't get any ideas," she muttered. "No, ma'am. Stop calling me ma'am." "Yes, June." She didn't correct him again. Inside the house, Mabel had started to cook. At first, it was burnt potatoes and dry cornbread. Then came soft eggs, tart apple pies, and warm biscuits that tasted of memory. She baked without fuss, humming old melodies as she mixed and kneaded. Caleb hovered nearby more and more each day, offering to fetch flour, split wood, carry water. "You don't have to help," she told him once. "I want to," he replied, not meeting her eyes. She handed him a spoon and pointed to the bowl. "Then stir, clockwise. No cheating." The evenings grew quiet in a different way. Not empty, not cautious, just peaceful. Levi played the fiddle on the porch. Mark told stories with no real endings, and June listened, leaning against a post, her arms crossed but relaxed. Molly would sometimes join them, sitting beside Thomas, not touching, not talking, just being. One night she finally asked him, "Why haven't you asked us to leave?" Thomas shrugged. "You haven't tried to leave. Would you stop us?" "No." "Then why do you care?" He took his time before answering. "Because I have seen the door slammed shut on deserving people too many times. Perhaps it's time someone held it open." She nodded slowly. "Not many men think that way." "No, but more should." The new well was finished in 6 days. Not deep, not perfect, but enough. Molly and Levi had carved out each layer as if it were a promise. When water finally seeped from the bottom, dark and thick, like a newly found blood vessel of the earth, Molly leaned on her shovel and grinned. "You didn't think I'd stick it out, did you?" she said. Levi wiped the sweat from his brow. "Didn't think anything. Just hoped." "Hope is a dangerous thing." He met her eyes. "Giving up is more dangerous." That night, they all sat together for supper. No lines drawn, no eyes downcast. The stew was warm, the biscuits golden. June passed the salt to Mark without a word. Mabel laid her fork down gently, her hands folded in contentment. Thomas raised his glass of water. They all laughed. Even Molly smiled, a true smile. Later, as twilight fell, Molly walked beside the garden, where the rose bushes were still bare but waiting. Levi joined her. He didn't speak, nor did she. But she handed him a trowel and gestured to the soil. "Plant something," she said. "If it lives, it lives. If not, we try again." And he did. In the stillness of that night, the house no longer felt like it was holding its breath. It exhaled, slow and steady. And deep in the quiet earth, things began to grow. The days that followed settled over the Granger ranch like a soft quilt, worn but warm. Nothing grand happened, and nothing needed to. The threat had receded. The past was still present, but quiet now, like a storm seen far off on the plains, still remembered, but no longer roaring overhead. Spring had ripened. The air carried the scent of pollen and damp earth, the fragrance of things alive and still becoming. Then a horseman appeared. He arrived on a Tuesday, just before sunset. The horizon still wore the day's golden hues, but the wind suddenly carried a strange smell, the smell of sweat, gunpowder, and ill intent. His horse kicked up dust as it halted at the fence, its nostrils flaring. The man did not dismount. Thomas was the first to step out, wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't reach for a weapon, just watched. His son stood behind him, silent. The girl slowly appeared in the doorway, Molly's hand instinctively reaching back to steady Mabel. The rider leaned forward. "I've come to take back what's mine," he rasped. No one answered. Harlan Creed took off his hat and spat into the dirt. His hair was longer than before, more silver than blonde, and his eyes twitched with anger. The revolver at his hip gleamed, well-oiled. "You think I forgot?" he called out louder. "You think you can just walk off with them, as if they were yours to give away?" Thomas stepped off the porch, slow and measured. "They walked away from you. They're still mine by law." "No, they're not." Harlan sneered. "This ain't a courtroom, friend." Thomas's jaw tightened. "That's right. This is a home. And you're not welcome here." Mark moved closer to June. Caleb silently moved to shield Mabel. Levi didn't move, but his entire body was tense like a drawn bow. A storm waiting to break. Molly stepped forward, her voice cut, clear and sharp, through the air. "We are not yours. We are not for sale, and we are not going anywhere." Harlan looked at her, then at the house, the barn, the fields behind them. "You think this little happy family setup changes anything? You think a few hot meals and soft words make you something better than what you are?" "No," Molly said, "but it makes us free." "Free?" He laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You're just a bunch of charity cases." Levi stepped forward, his face hard as stone. "Say that again." "Why? You plan on fighting me over someone else's mistake?" Thomas raised a hand, stopping Levi's next step. His voice remained low. "I'm only going to ask one last time. Leave." Harlan dismounted slowly. The revolver stayed in its holster, but his hand hovered near it. "You think I'm alone?" From the trail, 2 more riders appeared, younger men, rough-looking and scarred. Harlan jerked a thumb toward them. "They're here to see that justice is done." Caleb swallowed hard. Mark clenched his fists. The girls didn't flinch. Molly's gaze never left Harlan's. June's fingers flexed at her sides. Mabel had retreated behind the doorframe. The standoff stretched on in silence. But then from the opposite hill, another horse galloped forth, dust curling at its heels. It was the sheriff. He pulled his horse to a hard stop beside Harlan, his weary eyes taking in the tense scene. "Something I should know about?" he asked. Harlan gestured widely. "This man stole my daughters. Took them like they were property." The sheriff looked at Thomas, then at Molly. Is that true? No, Molly said. We left. He was selling us on. A crate outside the saloon. This man offered us safety. Nothing else. I've got witnesses, Harlan said. I've got bruises, June snapped. It's their word against mine. The sheriff dismounted. He looked more tired than the silver star on his chest, weary of this kind of trouble. He scratched his beard, then glanced toward Thomas. You took them in? I opened my door, Thomas said. They walked in on their own. You plan on marrying them off? Harlan asked, venom behind his sneer. Turn them into Granger property? No one belongs to anyone here, Thomas replied. The sheriff turned back to the girls. Do you want to stay? Yes, Molly said. He nodded slowly. Then I have no cause to move them. Harlan stepped forward furiously. You're siding with them, with him? I'm siding with what the law says, the sheriff muttered. And the law doesn't recognize daughters as collateral for debt. But the sheriff cut him off with a look. You say one more word, Harlan, and I'll lock you up for public threat and trespassing. Harlan's lip curled. He turned to his men, snarled something under his breath. The three of them stood for a moment longer, trying to hold their ground on pride alone. Then Harlan spat in the dirt again, turned, and mounted his horse. This isn't over, he said, his voice low. Thomas didn't blink. Here, it is. They rode off, the sound of their hooves like closing doors. The sheriff lingered a moment, then tipped his hat. You've got a tough piece of land here, Thomas. Don't lose it. We won't, Thomas said. The sheriff rode off. Silence. Returned, but this time it was trembling and light with relief. Levi exhaled a long breath. Mark looked as though he might fall apart. Caleb stepped back inside without a word. Molly turned to Thomas. You didn't have to do that. He met her eyes. Yes, I did. She looked as if she might say more, but the words never formed. Later that night, when the lanterns were lit and the dinner table was full again, no one spoke of the man with the gun, or the law that hadn't come soon enough. They talked about the well, about the planting, and about the full moon expected next week. They had won a war fought not with bullets, but with something harder, mercy. The days that followed settled over the Granger ranch like the afternoon sun. Nothing grand happened, and nothing needed to. The threat had vanished, leaving behind a quiet that was now filled not with fear, but with the familiar rhythms of life. The porch had become a silent stage, where trust was slowly unveiled each evening. Molly had claimed the garden as her own. She wore no bonnet, letting the sun kiss her skin, and no longer flinched when it burned. She planted with a focused purpose, watered with the tenderness of someone who had once been left to wither for too long. Caleb often came to her side, still quiet as ever, but now his hands offered more than just help. He brought her seeds wrapped in linen, old books on the weather, and once, a faded plum-colored ribbon, which she accepted with a nod that meant more than 1,000 words. Levi had fixed the chicken coop door for the 3rd time that week. June said he was obsessive. He replied that the hinges were just stubborn. She rolled her eyes but always stayed close, within 5 paces, one foot always pointed toward him. One evening, she caught him watching her as she brushed Mabel's hair and kissed her forehead. You look at me as if I'm soft, she said. I look at you as if you've survived, he replied. Same thing. He didn't argue this time. Mabel was a different song altogether. She sang now, not for others, but to the wind, to the well, to the bread she baked before dawn. She rode bareback on the old Mari in the field behind the barn, her braids flying. Mark had crafted her a small harp from willow branches and fishing line. She played it out of tune for days, but always with a pure joy. They didn't call what they had a family, not yet. The words still carried too much weight. But something deeper had taken root, and roots, after all, never ask for permission to grow. It was Molly who first brought up the idea. She did it the way she did everything, with care and a touch of fire. She stood on the porch after supper, arms crossed, the sky behind her soaked in lavender. Thomas was lighting his pipe. Levi was oiling a hinge. "We've been here for months," Molly said. Thomas looked up. And we're not guests anymore. We're not looking to leave. That's the truth." "I know." She took a breath. "We'd like to talk to all of you." He rose slowly. The boys followed. The 6 of them sat around the dining table. No food this time, just folded hands and steady eyes. It was June who began. She never flinched from the fire. "I want to marry Levi," she said. "Not because he saved me, not because I owe him anything, but because he treats me like I'm not broken." Levi swallowed hard, his hand twitching on the table. Thomas nodded once, a quiet acknowledging gesture. Mark cleared his throat. "I'd like to ask for Mabel's hand." "She's young," Thomas said. "I'll wait, if I have to." Mabel smiled and squeezed his hand. "I don't want him to wait." Thomas looked at her. "Are you sure?" "Yes," she said. "He makes the world quiet." Then came Molly. She didn't sit up straight, didn't smile. She just reached for Caleb's hand and held it. "I spent years thinking love had to be earned through pain. But Caleb, he never asked me to be anything, just let me be." Caleb blushed then. Whispered, she was already everything. Thomas leaned back. He looked at his sons, at the girls who had once stood on a crate like ghosts. He thought of his late wife, her voice in the breeze, her silence in the garden. "You don't need my permission," he said, "but you have my blessing." They married under the cottonwood trees. The whole town came, mostly out of curiosity, but the ceremony wasn't grand. There were no lace veils or silver rings. The dresses were sewn by Molly and Mabel, simple and soft. June wore her boots. Mabel wore wildflowers in her hair. Thomas stood before them, not as a preacher, but as a witness. Their vows were not flowery. They were promises forged from scars. They kissed, not as strangers, but as people who had already built a life together. That night, the ranch glowed. Lanterns hung from the trees. Fiddle music swayed in the breeze. Molly stood under the stars, Caleb beside her, his hand resting lightly on her back. Not to claim, just to say, "I'm here." Thomas sat on the porch, his pipe in one hand, a mug in the other. He watched them all, his sons, his new daughters. Mark sat beside him after a while. "You did good, Pa," Mark said. "I just opened a door. Sometimes that's enough." Molly approached alone, holding something wrapped in cloth. She came to Thomas and placed it in his lap. He slowly unwrapped it. It was the cedar dove he had carved. Now coated in white paint, its wings decorated with tiny flowers. "We wanted you to have it," she said. He looked at her, his eyes unreadable. "You kept us alive," she added. "But more than that, you gave us a place to be." He ran his thumb along the wings. "You gave me something too," he said. She waited. A reason to finish what I started. She sat beside him, both of them watching the lanterns flicker in the trees like captured stars. The others gradually joined them on the porch. Mabel leaned against the railing, plucking her harp. June brought out leftover pie. Caleb fell asleep on the top step. No one spoke the word home. They didn't need to. It was present in every breath, in every vow carved into the air and held firm by kindness. The wind shifted again, gentler now, as if the land itself were exhaling. In a world that had once sold them, doubted them, and broken them, here they stood, not bought, not beaten, but blooming together. And on that quiet porch, under a sky too vast to hold all words, the past finally learned how to be silent.